Hello again! You should have read Lee Talley's essay on young adult for today, and also Catcher in the Rye through chapter 10 or page 76. And I will conclude with some questions on the novel in the next video. But first, I thought, since this class is literature for adolescents, we should address two introductory questions. So, a brief outline of today's class is, what is adolescence? What is young adult fiction? And a brief introduction to and some questions on Salinger's classic novel, Catcher in the Rye, which you have read half of. So first of all, what is adolescence? We're reading literature for adolescents. So what is adolescence? Press pause on this video and write down an answer. And you'll add that answer to the comments when you make those. So go ahead, press pause. I'll wait. Okay, what did you write? I ask because we all know something about adolescence. We all have been through adolescence. We didn't arrive here at this moment in time with no sense of what adolescence means. But I also ask because there's a lot that we may not think about. So, for example, when does adolescence begin? When does adolescence end? Well, according to the World Health Organization, it begins at 10 and ends at 19. Traditionally in the US, it's sort of between 12 and 18. Another way of thinking about that debate is the age of consent. You might see that as the moment that marks the beginning of adolescence and maybe the beginning of adulthood. What do I mean by the age of consent? Well, it's a legal term. It's the age at which a person is considered legally competent to consent to sex, to having sex. Prior to that, sex could be considered statutory rape because the sex would be, by definition, non-consensual. So that's one way of thinking about it. What's the age of consent in Kansas? Do you know? I'll pause while you think here for a moment. It's 16. 16 for both boys and girls, and that is actually fairly standard across the US and much of the Western world, but it is also not completely standard. It does vary by age and even by gender. At the upper end, it's 18. The lower end, it's 14. In Arkansas, Indiana, and Iowa, for example, but only if the sexual partner is no more than 4 years older. After that, the age rises to 16. As I say, the age of consent is typically 16 in U.S. states and most Western countries, but this really varies around the world to as low as 12 in Mexico and the Philippines and Angola, as high as 20 in Tunisia, and some countries require marriage first. That's true in Iran, in Sudan, in Kuwait, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. And I'm only speaking of heterosexual intercourse here. Same-sex intercourse is actually illegal in a number of countries, and the age of consent varies there as well. So there's no consensus here either if we think about the age of consent as a marker of adolescence. Teen itself, for example, is a mid-20th century idea. What about puberty? That's another way of thinking about it, right? When does puberty begin? That can vary too. In girls, between the ages of 9 and 16, they're usually 10 or 11. In boys, between maybe 11 and 15, typically 11 and 12. These dates have changed, though. They're not historically consistent. They've changed across time. The age of puberty's onset has dropped quite a bit since the 1840s. In fact, from 1840 through 1950, among Western European women, the average age of menstruation decreased by 4 months in each decade. In Japan, the decline happened later and more rapidly. From 1945 to 1975, the age of menstruation dropped 11 months per decade. Why? Why? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that. One answer that's been proposed is weight gain in the world's young people, and that could be good. Better nutrition, more food, or not so good. Rise in childhood obesity, especially here in the United States. Another possible answer is hormones, and steroids, and chemicals, and other additions that's put into the food. But whatever the cause, girls' puberty begins between 9 and 16, and boys between 13 and 15. So even that varies. Okay, one other question for you here about adolescence, and that is, what are the social characteristics of adolescence? What are the social characteristics of adolescence? Pause this video and write them down. I'm confident that as humans who have successfully passed through adolescence yourselves, you will be able to identify these characteristics. Okay, now that you've unpaused the video, I don't think there's any great need for me to answer this, actually. We'll talk more in the discussion. Okay, so we talked a little bit about adolescence. That was part 1. What about part 2, you ask? What about literature for adolescence? What about the very title of this class? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that is next. So, you have read Lee Telley's essay, Young Adult, which appears in this book, but I made a PDF of it for you. You've read it. What are the key points that she makes in the essay? Now that you've read the essay, if you had to define young adult, what would you definitely want to include? And rather than answer that here and summarize the essay for you, this is something you will do. So pause for a moment, write some of those things down, and then resume playing the video. Thank you. So a list of first young adult or YA novels might include S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, written when she actually was a young adult. It might include Robert Lipsyte's The Contender, Paul Zindel's The Pigman, Robert Cormier's The Chocolate War. These are all from the late 60s, early 70s, and I, in fact, have taught The Chocolate War in this class before. Some would say, and it would be fair to say, that these novels established the form of literature that we today call the young adult novel. But that really also wouldn't be fair to say. Works now considered young adult classics did not appear out of nowhere. The Catcher in the Rye, for example, was published in 1951, and the stories in it were first published in the 1940s. There's William Golding's The Lord of the Flies from 1955. There's A Separate Piece from 1959. All of these are told via literary realism, like classic young adult YA novels. They highlight moral and social concerns, and they have coming-of-age themes, right? Themes about social identity and peer relationships and independence from family, social responsibility, those kind of themes. But even that's not enough. We can go back even further, right? Louisa May Alcott's Little Women from 1869, or Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn from 1884, or L.M. Montgomery's Anne in Green Gables and its many sequels. The first of these was published in 1906. Those too could be considered literature for adolescents. And even that could be revised, right? You may have noticed that that list of books is fairly white. What about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs? I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We will complicate this a little further in subsequent classes. The point is that there's a very long history to literature read by adolescents. The Catcher in the Rye is our class's gesture to that history, and this lecture itself is the gesture to that history. We will mostly read books that were written in the last 30 years and as recently as the last year, actually. We have several books from 2017 on our list. Anyway, we'll conclude with those questions that I asked you during this, and you can write those down below. So what is adolescence? What did you write down? What are the social characteristics of adolescence? What did you write down for that? And drawing on Lee Talley's essay, what is young adult? What does that mean? And we'll come to the first half of The Catcher in the Rye in the next video. So, to be continued.